And the truth is, the progressive left has declared war for a long time on the creation order.
All right, let's see it.
Things we see in Genesis, like life, are made in the image of God. Marriage, gender, sexuality, even things like work that existed before sin and are good things in God's creation.
So I want to start off by pointing something out. It does not make much sense to say that the progressive left is waging war against the book of Genesis's take on life, marriage, sexuality, gender, and work. Because the things that Genesis has to say about those issues are not in alignment, for the most part, with how any of us really approach those issues today. It makes more sense, it's still inaccurate, but it makes more sense to say the progressive left is waging war against the right-wing authoritarian and Christian nationalist renegotiations of what's in Genesis related to those issues. So when this pastor says life and then elaborates, we're created in the image of God, this is a paraphrase of Genesis 1:26 and 27. This is clearly about abortion. But Genesis never addresses abortion. And this pastor imagines that Genesis takes a pro-life stance, that life begins at conception. And that's just not in Genesis. In fact, it's not anywhere in the entire Bible. The Bible never once addresses abortion. And the closest it comes to addressing abortion is addressing the question of when the soul enters the body, ensoulment, when a fetus or a baby becomes a full legal and moral person. And the problem with this pastor's take is that, according to the Bible, it's not really until birth, until the baby draws their first breath. Breath is fundamentally constitutive of human life in the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament has adopted Greco-Roman conventions and philosophical frameworks related to the question of ensoulment. And so it's more debatable for the folks who wrote the New Testament, but they never say a word about it in the New Testament. You have to look at other writings of early Christians in order to figure out where they're standing on that issue. But if we're looking in the Bible or even just in Genesis, there's nothing pro-life about Genesis. There's nothing that supports the contemporary right-wing authoritarian and Christian nationalist approach to abortion. So this pastor is not concerned with what Genesis says about life. This pastor is concerned for leveraging Genesis as a trump card, as the ultimate authority in debates about abortion. But they're not taking Genesis on its own terms. They're reading into Genesis what they want to find in there. So these issues that are named, life, marriage, sexuality, gender, work, are all right-wing authoritarian and Christian nationalist identity markers. Abortion, marriage, and here I think they're specifically talking about gay marriage, but they could also be talking about just traditional nuclear family marriage. Sexuality, they're talking about LGBTQIA identities there. Gender, they're obviously talking about trans folks there. Work, and here we're bringing in work requirements for social safety net benefits, it seems to me. I don't know what on earth they could be talking about that the progressive left is waging war against related to Genesis's approach to work, unless they're trying to leverage Genesis to insist that folks who want benefits from the government have to have a work requirement. Again, a right-wing authoritarian Christian nationalist identity marker. So the main point I'm trying to make here is that when this pastor talks about the progressive left waging war on these things, this pastor is identifying the culture war as the battleground that they're addressing here. But that's going to rather conflict with something they're going to say next.
And many pastors have been silent for fear of being labeled as a Christian nationalist or too political. And with the spiritual war at stake, I just want to let you know that I just do not care. I do not care. And because I don't even know what those things mean. I'm not interested in a culture war. I'm interested in what Senator Ted Cruz referred to Charlie Kirk as, a happy warrior. A happy warrior. Or because of our convictions about Christ, that we're willing to engage in the battle for truth that God has placed us in.
So this pastor is entirely and exclusively committed to a cultural war. That is all they care about. But they're using this rhetorical proxy of a spiritual war to try to mask that. Because when you get up and speak to your congregation, it is not helpful to remind them that the priority here is structuring power and values and boundaries in ways that serve our own temporal interests over and against the interests of groups that we don't like. That isn't really a helpful sermon. And so you have to use this mask of a spiritual war against who? Against the progressive left? And what are the battlegrounds of this spiritual war? Oh, all the identity markers of Christian nationalism and right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation? In the Venn diagram of the spiritual war and the cultural war, there is a single circle. And the fundamental motivator of this is the worship of power and access to power and resources. That's what this is all about. And the notion that you're motivated by convictions about Christ, and that's why you care about abortion and you care about the LGBTQIA identities and you care about work requirements in order to get government benefits, you're giving away the store that you don't really care about what Jesus talked about, because Jesus talked about a lot of other stuff that you're just shoving out of the way. In fact, the kinds of things that you attribute to the enemy, the progressive left, because Jesus dismissed the concerns of a lot of his opponents and said they were ignoring the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. Jesus never once said anything about abortion or about work requirements for government benefits. Jesus talked about the need to care for the poor and the orphan and the widow. Jesus excoriated people who didn't like the idea of a Samaritan being more of a neighbor to a Jewish person than other Jewish people, because those people hated Samaritans. Jesus was talking about other kinds of things as the priority. Now, this is not to say that I think that progressive leftists have perfectly encapsulated and captured Jesus' message. They haven't, because Jesus was not a progressive leftist. He was a radical, but in first century CE, Galilee and Judea, what was radical for them is a different collection of concerns than what is radical for us today in the 21st century. But there's a lot more overlap with Jesus's concern and the concerns of the progressive left than there is with Jesus's concerns and right-wing authoritarians who are just worshiping power. This pastor doesn't have the first clue what he's talking about. He has certainly not thought critically about his motivations, and he is certainly not representing what Genesis actually has to say about life, about marriage, about sexuality, about gender, or about work. He's just promoting right-wing authoritarian, social dominance orientation, and Christian nationalist ideologies in order to advance his interests within the culture war that he has to misrepresent as some kind of spiritual war. This is laughable rhetoric. And the fit for this video has been the Avengers.